Welcome to Reaction with me, Iain Martin, editor of Reaction. Today we're talking to Andrew Mitchell about his new book, Beyond a Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. Welcome, Andrew Mitchell. It's a very unusual book. We'll get to why that is the case in a few minutes. But why did you write it now?
Well, it's all the fault of your colleague, the senior journalist Michael Crick, who at the start of lockdown said to me, how are you going to fill the long evenings while your wife is doctoring in the NHS in London and you're looking after your constituents in the Midlands? And he said to me, why don't you write a book and why don't you put in it all those funny stories you've told me down the years about whipping and about Boris Johnson? Because if you don't do it, I'm going to stick it in my own diaries. So I said, after a bit of, toing and froing, I said to him, well, look, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll write those two chapters, the chapter on whipping, which I've entitled Whipping Like Stripping is Best Done in Private, and the chapter on Boris, which is my role in his ascent. Anyway, then unbeknownst to me, he sent these two chapters, which I sent to him, to his agent. And the rest all sort of followed from that. And I nervously wrote the rest of it, and the agent liked it. And then Bite Back decided they liked to publish it. So it all really came from that.
So you've been cabinet minister, been at the top of UK politics for a long time, seen a lot, and we'll come to all of that. Boris, we'll also discuss the Plebgate scandal as well, and there's a really interesting chapter at the end as well on lessons learned. But let's go right back to the beginning, Andrew Mitchell, before you were an MP. I mean, in terms of upbringing, it's a very funny portrait of school, of university, and the army. It really is a very, very amusing and quite affecting read. But it does come across, also with the family background, the family business, is that it's a quintessentially English establishment upbringing, isn't it?
It is, and I'm sort of quite clear about that. I say right at the very beginning that mine has been a privileged life, and it has. And the subtitle is Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey. And what struck me was that I have been a member of almost all the sort of establishment bodies in Britain. I mean, I haven't been a member, obviously, of the monarchy, but everything else pretty well is there, from prep school to rugby, to the army, to Cambridge, to the City of London, to Parliament, and to the Cabinet, and to the Privy Council. So all of that struck me as being of interest. But all those organisations, all of them, have changed almost out of all recognition during my lifetime. And so I wanted to sort of describe that. And you were very kind about my school days. But looking back on it, it was quite extraordinary. That the sort of British upper middle classes paid good money to send their children away to be abused at school. And Alex Renton, who's the son of an MP, has written a book about my prep school, which is replete with horror and anger. And so I write with some care, because although I don't think it did me much damage, my wife, a doctor, would probably disagree with that. But I think for a lot of people, it did do them an awful lot of damage in life. But I've been a member of all those groups. I'm not for a moment suggesting that I'm not still a member of the establishment, or you'd roar with laughter and say, of course you are. But I am a much more cynical member of the establishment, and I think a more realistic member, because when I first became a member of Parliament, I very much wanted to be part of that establishment. But today, I'm much more sceptical, and I can't deny I'm a part of it, but I'm a country member.
That's a very English establishment way of phrasing it, describing yourself as a country member. But there's a wonderful story of you, and I think Adair Turner read Adair sometimes described going on a speaking tour, a debating tour of the United States, and trying to do your English sort of debating shtick in front of, I think, 1,000 Christian students, and the proposition is.
Yes, that's right. We were he and I have to say, were very arrogant because we offered our American hosts 10 debating subjects, which were mainly designed to provoke them. And we offered to speak on either side. And so we had the motion, I think, that Christianity is an elaborate superstition. And we offered to speak on either side. And we were asked to speak in favor of the motion in Colorado. We turned up and there were 1,000 members of the Christian Union there. And I sort of made my jokes and put the case for Christianity being an elaborate superstition. And the person on the other side of the debate, when he stood up, the first thing he said is, before I demolish all Andrew's arguments and Adair's, I want us to pray for their immortal souls. And at the end of the debate, I think we got 5 votes. I think they were pity votes. They were pity votes. They weren't sort of supporting. The other 995 voted against us.
And then the army, the city. Really good chapter on Lazard, describing that. I sometimes write books about financial history, and I'm fascinated by the history of the city and the culture of that period. But what you describe is it is extraordinary that Britain made any money at all in the 1960s and 1970s.
Yeah, I mean, the first Lazard never made, and the city people never made real money until much later. The first time Lazard made money actually was when John Knott returned from politics, went back to the city, came into Lazard as a director of Lazard, and very quickly became the chairman. And that was the point where Lazard started making money, partly because of the brilliant people that he recruited, but also because of the different types of business he set up. But before Big Bang, no one talked about their salaries and remuneration. For example, in Lazard, it was a sackable offence to talk about your salary to another employee. You didn't poach other people's clients, or if they came to you, you rang up the person from whom they'd come to sort of rather embarrassedly apologise for pinching their clients. And of course, when the Americans came and Big Bang happened, the whole thing was blown apart. And because a lot of these businesses didn't have much capital and didn't make much money, the Americans were very easily able to buy them up. And so the system of the merchant banks, the accepting houses, into which I went in 1979, that was all sort of blown away. And in fact, of the accepting houses then, the only 2 that are left, I think now, are Rothschilds and Lazard. And that was mainly because they only did advisory work, and they didn't want. John Knott kept us out of, the buying a money-based, a capital-based entity, and so those are the only 2 that really have survived. That's because they did advisory work. Basically, they had no balance sheets.
Yeah, no, John Knott, was really a transformative force in the city. Then, so politics. Why politics? You'll be asked this question a lot, but was it just an assumption that you would do it? I mean, you were obviously interested in political ideas. You were interested in how power worked. I mean, what was it that made you think, right, I'm going to give up what would have been an extremely profitable career, carrying on staying in the city in one form or another, and decide instead to become an MP?
Well, I'd had a father who was in the House of Commons, so I'd been able to see the pluses and minuses of politics at one remove. And when I've been at Cambridge, I've been very fortunate. I've been president of the Cambridge Union. I've been chairman of the Cambridge University Conservative Association. And so I mean, it was in my blood, I think. But when I left university, I thought I should forget about politics and go and get a proper job. And I spent very interesting times at Lazard in the early years working with British exporters, trying to win big ticket projects against the Japanese and the Germans and the French and Italians and Americans and so forth. And I saw the decline in Britain, which Mrs. Thatcher started to put right at that time, and then I think largely did put right. So I was never sort of not aware of politics, and I used to shout at the television screen and when things were going wrong under Labour beforehand, and people said to me, well, instead of shouting at television, why don't you do something about it? So it was sort of a mixture of, I think, it in my blood, and also, irritation at what was going on. But I sort of confess in the book that I wasn't ideologically driven. I mean, I was a conservative because I thought the Conservatives ran the country better. They managed it better. And I didn't really believe in anything very deeply at that stage in my career. But I've come latterly to believe deeply in things and to really care about some of the things that our government is doing and some of the things they're not doing. So I've come, if you like, I've come to ideological belief quite late. Most people have ideological belief and then go into politics. I'd rather think I was the other way around.
To what extent, though, did you see it when you started in politics as, and again, this is maybe a function of, or English establishment behaviour. To what extent did you see it as a game, or a business with rules and a set of customs, traditions, ways of talking, speaking that could be adopted, and success would follow?
Well, I certainly saw, if you're a government whip in difficult times, or an opposition whip in difficult times, the gamesmanship of it is very, very prevalent, because you're operating under a set of rules, and the government whips decide when they're going to hold votes, how they're going to hold votes. They work out to check they've got the majorities and so on. The government whip's job is to get the business through, and that there is an act of gamesmanship in that, of course. And the British sort of sense of fair play and gamesmanship is an important part of the House of Commons and the way it operates. I think more widely that the element of game has declined for me over my time, and the element of ideological importance has grown, and nowhere more so than in the issues affecting Britain's internationalism and Britain's role in the world.
Yeah, we'll come on to that on a second. Just another question on the whipping operation, and the notion of, which, as you said, sort of best done almost in secret. But it is a strange part of the system. I've discussed this with various journalists and politicians down the years, people who have been whips or people who have a particular view of how it works. There is a view, isn't there, a sort of Tory establishment view, that the whipping operation is everything. It's the root of politics. It's how control is maintained, how power is secured and wielded, and that anyone who really wants to get on and then be useful as a cabinet minister and to do a really serious job needs to understand how that process works. And then there are others that say, well, actually, hold on, it is a weird arcane part of our system which just does emphasize. It is almost anti-ideological, isn't it? If you're going to be a successful whip, you have to remove your personal views, or you almost have to park not your conscience, but you have to say you are delivering X, which is a certain number of votes, and persuading people, and that's that.
Yes, that's exactly right, and you've expressed the two views. I mean, Enoch Powell, I think it was, who said that cities need sewer, the governments need whips office in the same way that cities need sewers, and that's one view. On the other hand, Michael Heseltine once told me that his one of his few regrets in politics, apart from not being prime minister, was that he'd never served as a whip. And I think also, as a whip, you know everything about everything, and you're at the centre of the wheel. If you go out into a department, you're out at the edge of the spokes. So it's a very different experience. And of course, when we had the whip's office over Maastricht between 1993 and 1995, we kept John Major's government afloat. Night after night, we'd have votes at 2 or 3 in the morning, and we'd win them by 3 or 2 votes. And you're right also that whipping, the Prime Minister and the Cabinet will ask the Chief Whip whether they can get something through the House of Commons, for which there's only 3 answers the Chief Whip can give. He can say yes, in which case things take their course. He can say no, in which case the government has to think again. Or he can say, I will call you in 24 hours, or maybe even less than that. And then he will conduct an exercise of finding out and all the whips finding out from their flock how they will vote. And then the chief will have to make a judgment about whether or not he can persuade those people who are recalcitrant about whether they will support the government or not. And also, if the cabinet determined that they're going to bring forward a bill to slaughter the firstborn, it's not the whip's job to query that. Once the cabinet have decided to do it and the chief whip has agreed, it's not, whips are not immoral or moral, they're amoral. So the job is then to go to your flock, the members of parliament who you look after, and explain to them that there are too many firstborns, and that it is fettering the opportunities for the second-born and the third-born. And look at the demographics of your constituency. Have you seen how many second-born and third-born there are in your constituency? It's a win-win for you. That's why you must sort the government in getting through the House the Slaughter of the Firstborn Act. And that is the essence, really, of how whipping works. I mean, obviously, I've chosen a very extreme example, but I hope it helps explain the role of a whip. It's not, I remember when I was with Alan Howarth, who was a friend and that subsequently crossed the floor, actually, which I thought he might do. And he came to me to plead with me about a measure on education. And I said to him, listen, I'm your whip. All I worry about is whether you're going to vote for or against the government. If you've got a worry about this measure, go and see the minister. And I remember Alan looking at me down his nose with complete contempt because he thought that I should be concerned about the issue he'd raised. But that's not the whip's job, really.
Yeah. Now, so we're just going to mention again, talking to Andrew Mitchell, former cabinet minister, Conservative MP, author of Beyond A Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey, which is out now. In the I just had one question just about the whipping. People might wonder about one aspect of what you said. How does it then work in practical terms? So you have the chief whip. Explain to people that then there are the whips. There's the whipping team below that. They're then divided up so that they have X number of MPs who are under their wing, and they're supposed to keep tabs on those MPs and make contact with them. How does that work now in practical terms? Is that, I mean, in the olden days, that would be running into people in the corridor, taking them for a gin and tonic if there was a problem. Now, is it conducted mainly by WhatsApp?
Well, it's done by both. WhatsApp is a sort of additional thing. I mean, I've had a drink with my whip. He calls me up quite often, and I call him up from time to time. The relationship is really precisely as it was when it started, that the whipper in, it's a fox hunting metaphor, and the whipper in, is part of fox hunting, corralling the hounds onto the fox, and as was. And that's the derivation of whipping. The job, a really good whip knows everything about the members of their flock. They know their fears, their hopes, their aspirations. Of course, if you're a whip, you must always ensure that not everyone is interested in preferment, although most are, but it's very important to keep hope alive.
So there's a chapter, we're going to come on to the transformation of the Tory party that you've seen in your time in politics. There's a chapter called Tory Decline and Renewal, because of course you're friends with David Davis, and you describe in 2001, coming back in 2001 after the election, just New Labour is in its pomp, even though there have been scandals about New Labour, it still has a massive majority, and it's pre 9/11, so nothing can really shift that. The Tory party is at that point in a much bigger hole than it expected to be, because there was some expectation that just almost by magic the size of the Labour majority would come down, but still in 2001 the Tory party is as far from power as it had been after the New Labour success in 1997. That then prompts a lot of soul searching, doesn't it? What's the direction of the party going to be? There's the IDS interlude. But then when it comes to that critical 2005 leadership race, you feel loyalty, obviously, to David Davis, your friend. But then there's David Cameron running the modernisation programme. So there's DD and there's DC, and you end up working for the latter. How did you see it as that moment of decision approached?
Well, I was very, very struck when I came back how much the party had changed since 1997. We went down in 1997, and I never thought that William would get many seats back in 2001. I remember telling him that even the Archangel Gabriel would not have been able to secure much Tory progress because it was Labour's time. We'd been in power for 18 years. And they'd done their first 4 years and nothing had gone spectacularly wrong. And they were going to get a second term. And I came back and William relinquished the leadership. And I then I supported David, but David pulled out quite quickly. And I then supported Ken Clarke, who I thought was the right person to re-establish the Tory connection with Middle England. And I don't think anything has persuaded me otherwise since, although he would have had a terribly difficult time riding the European tiger. And then in 2005, when I ran David's campaign, I have to say, when I took over running David's campaign, he was miles ahead. So it's one of my 3 great failures in politics was running David's campaign and him going from certain conqueror to loser on that. But of course, one of the interesting things is that the difference between David Cameron and David Davis is enormous in terms of character and style. They're as alike as chalk and cheese. But actually, in what they were going to do for the party, the difference was not so great. I mean, for example, David copyrighted modern conservatism. And, he was very clear about, issues of equality. He was very, very clear indeed about getting more women into the party, more people representing ethnic minorities. He was very, very clear on gay rights and so forth. And so the actual difference between them wasn't as great as people perceived. And like the 2 speeches where we started to fade at the party conference, David Cameron's speech was very good, but it wasn't, fantastically brilliant. And Davis's speech was not so good, but it wasn't so awful. But the point is this, that David Cameron was the new thing. And the contrast, for example, between the launches of the 2 campaigns, where David's was done, in a oak-panelled Westminster room with suited people, whereas Cameron's was done in a light and airy grouping where there were lots of younger people, particularly women, some with children, and they were serving smoothers and so on. And it caught the imagination, and the rest is history. And when David Cameron became the party leader, of course, it wasn't set in stone that he would require the services of people like me, because I'd been a very staunch supporter of his opponent. But David Cameron sought to bring the party back together. I describe a conversation with him in the book where he said, "Mitch, I want to promote you. Do you want to do work and pensions?" And I said no. I thought that work and pensions would not be a promotion from international development, into which I was really getting my teeth at the time. And, David Davis wanted David Cameron to succeed in bringing the party back together again. So it was a proper regiment. And I have to say, I had an absolutely blessed relationship with David Cameron over international development, because we could complete each other's sentences. We were both totally joined at the hip on the importance of this. We wanted to build on what New Labour had done, make it less about money and more about results. And, it made a very easy relationship. And I was one of the few departments which Number 10 did not man Mark when David Cameron became Prime Minister. And on 3 occasions, officials in Whitehall tried to go behind my back to the Prime Minister to get him to stop me doing something I wanted to do. And on all 3 occasions, David Cameron said, "No, go with what Andrew thinks is right on this." So it was a wonderful relationship.
More on aid in a second, but just back to that 2005 leadership race, which it was very exciting politics. I remember that Blackpool conference very clearly. I've often wondered, though, if one of the reasons that you and David Davis launched the campaign in the way it was launched, as a traditional looking campaign, as you said, in a sort of oak, panelled Westminster room, was as a response to the way in which Portillo had failed in 2001 is that you didn't want to be, is that David Davis didn't want to be seen as, in Tory circles, the Portillo disaster was almost seen as a warning, wasn't it? That if you went too far down the modernisation route in terms of imagery, everyone drinking smoothies, it all looking far too metropolitan, you'd look disengaged and disconnected from a lot of Conservative voters.
Yes, actually, the reason why we did it in such a conservative way was because we were miles ahead, and at that stage,
Right.
we knew that that David Cameron could get all his supporters into a black cab. So we played it very, very safe, and we took no risk on that. And of course, we went too far in that because, as David Davis was definitely the favourite. The press, of course, quite rightly, were looking for the flaws in that. And David Cameron's launch, which was on the same day as ours, brilliantly fulfilled what they needed.
I remember one of your colleagues actually saying, who then didn't get promoted under David Cameron. Cameron wasn't forgiving of everyone, saying that, saying to David Cameron, look, they are... people are saying that you can get all of your supporters into a black taxi. That's an exaggeration. A Mini would do it. I mean, it really did seem at that point as though the Cameron thing was a lost cause that summer. Fascinating. Let's just talk about aid. And I just wanted to ask, where does this? Is obviously such a big part of your career. There's lots of it in the book when you come to run DFID, the department since closed by Boris Johnson or amalgamated with the Foreign Office.
Vaporised. Yes.
Where vaporised. Where did this come from?
Well, it came. I mean, it wasn't a particular passion of mine, especially in the early years. But what it was I'd always had a good relationship with the charities and NGOs that were international facing in my constituency. I knew them very well. They would come to me when they had campaigns. I was very interested in that. But it was because I was given the brief by Michael Howard. I had 5 years in opposition to try and turn. It was a completely Labour-controlled area. Indeed, the NGOs, when I first asked to speak to them, they had a meeting, I subsequently discovered, to discuss whether they needed to talk to this crusty old Tory about aid at all, since it was a Labour subject. And it was only when someone said, well, actually, the Tories might win an election one day, that they said, oh, well, perhaps we better talk to him then. But I then spent those next 5 years going around the world, sitting at the feet of people who really, really knew about development, to try and construct a centre-right development policy for Britain and to build on what Labour had done. I didn't want it to be a Labour or Tory approach. I wanted it to be a British approach to development. And I saw it as an area where Britain could be a superpower. Obviously, America is the military superpower, but I saw this was somewhere where British brain power from our universities, British experience of NGOs on the ground, British think tanks crafting policy amongst the best in the world. You know, we could be a superpower that really drove this agenda about tackling these obscene extremes of poverty around the world and doing something about them. And so I spent 5 years preparing for that. And the more I learnt, the more I felt that it was the cause of our time, and one that the Tories also could really advance, because Labour, our only criticism of Labour was they tended to throw money at problems, whereas we thought actually that wasn't good enough, particularly if you were going to go to the 0.7 and command public support for this. You had to demonstrate the results you were achieving. And so we tried to change it into a policy that stopped conflict, because conflict is development in reverse, and built prosperity, because having a job, whether you're in the poor world or in Britain, being economically active is the way you lift yourself up and lift yourself out of poverty. And when we made that the centre of our approach.
You describe in the book your part in the ascent of Boris. You're clearly furious about what's happened on the aid front under Boris Johnson. I mean, do you feel that when he said that aid was safe with him, when he told you that, what was going on in his brain? Do you think was he just doing a sort of old-fashioned piece of whipping, or did he believe it at the time, or did he not believe it?
Well, he wanted my vote, I'm sure, but he's always had my vote, because I've always thought that Boris is an exceptional politician. And I think, the best way for me to phrase, I think he changed his mind, but he changed his mind on DFID, and he changed his mind on the 0.7. But I don't think politics is dignified by people throwing around epithets about lying and breaking promises and so forth. I think he changed his mind.
What do you think will happen now? I mean, it's if you look at the numbers mapped out in the budget, is it a sort of slow march back to 0.7% of GDP being spent on aid?
Well, the Chancellor has said that he expects it to come back in 24, 25, and I want to take the Chancellor of the Exchequer at his word. But of course, in a way that underlines the huge error of judgment the government has made in stopping the 0.7, because if you turn the tap on and off like this over a 3-year period, you don't get the best results for the taxpayer. And so we are really beholden to spending this money, that for every hard-earned pound we take off the taxpayer, we get 100 pence of delivery on the ground. And chopping and changing it like this is not good. Programs will have been lost, they'll have to be restarted. Some of them will never be restarted. And in getting value for money for the British taxpayer, it's not sensible. And of course, look, Iain, at the COP. Britain has, I hope very much that Boris's brand of boosterish leadership will advance the aims of COP26 in Glasgow. But remember that if you go back, if you have the chairmanship of the G7, and you are the only one of the G7 who reduces its spending on the poorest, and you have the chairmanship of the COP, and you go back on the amount of money that is available for adaptation and mitigation in poor countries, as we have done, it's very difficult to lead from the rear. It's very difficult to persuade other countries to step up. Half my time as development secretary was spent in ringing up my counterparts around the rich world and saying, come on, pony up some money for this, follow our leadership and put some money. We're putting our money where our mouth is. You do the same. And I managed to persuade quite a lot of them to step up. But if you are withdrawing your money, what happens when you ring someone from the G7? They say, well, look, we are increasing our funding. You're decreasing yours. Come back and see us when you've restored the money that you previously promised. It's very, very difficult to lead from the rear.
Understood. Let's talk a little about the scandal that became known as Plebgate. There's a chapter in the book on it. It was obviously for you a transformative experience. And you describe the regrets you have about it. I mean, what would you have handled differently?
Well, I set out in the book, from start to finish, what I would have done differently. But of course, the whole thing ended in a terrible mess, because while numerous policemen were chased down by the press first, but then subsequently disciplined, and 4 were sacked for not telling the truth. One of them went to prison. I lost my libel case, and I should never, ever, although I thought I would win, of course, I would never have gone down that track. Otherwise, I should never, ever have placed my fate in the hands of a judge like that. And I greatly regret doing it. If I had just stopped at the point where Channel 4 dispatches blew the whole thing open and showed that the police officer whose evidence, the bystander at the gates of Downing Street, whose evidence, apparently independent, had done such damage to me in Downing Street, and who was subsequently found out to be a policeman in the same unit as all the others. If I had stopped at that point, then that would have been a sensible thing to do, and I would have, David Cameron has publicly said since that I'd have come back into his government. Actually, he said after that if he'd won the referendum, I would have come back, and that was when it was all over anyway. So the whole thing ended in a mess. And in the chapter, which, as I say, is the shortest chapter in the book, I'm really not engaging in all of that, partly for legal reasons and partly because, it's just too difficult. I tried to explain what it's like being caught up in a tremendous media squall and what it feels like to you and your family and what you go through. And I'm not making any special pleading for that, but politicians in Britain, probably rightly, are they're not particularly respected by the public, nor have they ever been. I mean, if you look back at the Gilray cartoons in the 18th century, you can see that politicians have never been respected. Respect is reserved for the dignified part of the Constitution, as Walter Bagehot set it out, the monarchy and so forth. And where politicians are engaged, politicians have great power. Of course, they should be subject to every possible transparency and openness, and I completely accept that. Politicians in Britain generally, people feel warmer towards their own MP than they do towards MPs in general. And you will hear countless times in the pub or in a cafe, MPs, they're all a shower, but ours is all right because he sorted out my auntie Floss's housing benefit, but the rest of them, they're dreadful. Ours is all right here. And that tends to be the view. And I think that politics is suffering from the utter denigration of politicians. Just won't get, if social media continues as it is, you simply won't get decent people coming into politics. And I think there needs to be a bit of a correction on all of that. And I'm trying to explain, that if what some politicians sometimes go through, which is almost existential, maybe is a punishment which doesn't fit the crime.
The final chapter is called What I've Learned, and that's it is an unusual book. It's unusual. It's unusually reflective. I say that politely compared to some of the political memoirs that I've read down the years. But after that plebgate business, it really has. I mean, that's why you talk about a reformed establishment lackey. I think in the title is that it really, the whole thing really, the story shakes your faith in British institutions. You're sent in it almost, or it comes close to destroying your not belief in country, but your sense of how the country works. I mean, you clearly enter public life thinking that it's a pretty orderly setup, and that there's a set of rules that you can understand and navigate, and then you get sucked into this scandal and your view changes.
I think what you have just said expresses it much better than I do in the book, actually. I felt bitterly let down, but in the end, many people in their lives go through existential crises, and in the end, for me, it was a straight choice between chuntering about this for the rest of my days, like a slightly embarrassing maiden aunt at a Christmas party, or drawing a line. And I remember David Blunkett, the former Labour cabinet minister, he told me, he said, these searing experiences, it takes 3 years to get over. And I remember waking up after 3 years, not after the legal case, but after settling the case. So 3 years after 2016, and realizing that I was through it. And you either behave like that maiden aunt, or you draw a line and you say, that is in the past. I've now got the future to address. And I didn't think it was fair on anyone, particularly my wonderful, wonderful friends and family who'd stood by me during all those terrible years. I didn't think it was fair to go on about it. So I literally have put it out of my mind. And writing the chapter in the book was tough, and I did it last. If I'd done it first, I wouldn't have written the book, I suspect. But I did it last, right at the end, and it went through a lot of iterations. And as I say, I just hope people reading it will not think I'm revisiting the case as such, but just telling a story about what it's like being caught up in these things.
Understood. Andrew Mitchell, author of Beyond A Fringe, Tales from a Reformed Establishment Lackey, which is out now, published by Bite Back. Andrew, thank you for spending time with us today. If you're not a subscriber to Reaction on YouTube, just hit the subscribe button. If you're listening on the podcast, that's terrific as well. And if you're not a subscriber to Reaction on the main site and you want my weekly political newsletter and our columnists such as Tim Marshall on geopolitics, Maggie Pagano on business, and all the work that the rest of the Reaction team do, then below this is a link to become a subscriber to a member of Reaction, I should say, actually, and sign up. Until next time, thank you very much, Andrew Mitchell, and thank you to all of you for watching and listening.